The philosophy often referred to as the art of being alone begins by rejecting a common assumption that being alone is equivalent to lacking something. Within this framework, solitude is not treated as a deficit state, but as a distinct mode of existence, governed by its own internal logic rather than defined by comparison to social interaction. At the conceptual level, it is necessary to distinguish between isolation and solitude. Isolation is externally imposed or internally resisted. It carries connotations of exclusion, deprivation, or disconnection. Solitude, by contrast, is a condition that can be actively inhabited. It is not merely the absence of others, but the presence of oneself without distraction. This distinction is foundational because it reframes the experience from passive to active. In isolation, the individual is positioned as lacking connection. In solitude, the individual becomes the primary point of reference, engaging with their own thoughts, perceptions, and internal structures without immediate external mediation. From a philosophical standpoint, solitude introduces a shift in epistemic orientation. In social contexts, perception and interpretation are often co-constructed, validated, challenged, or shaped through interaction. Alone, the individual must rely on internal processes to evaluate experience. This does not eliminate distortion, but it alters its source. Instead of external influence, the primary variables become attention, memory, and interpretation. This shift can initially produce discomfort. Without external input, cognitive patterns that are normally distributed across interaction become concentrated. Thoughts that might otherwise be interrupted or redirected persist longer, revealing structures that are less visible in socially saturated environments. Solitude, in this sense, acts as a magnifier of internal content. The magnification effect is neutral in itself. It can bring clarity or confusion, insight or rumination. The outcome depends on how the individual engages with the process. If approached without structure, solitude may lead to repetitive loops of thought. If approached deliberately, it can become a method of cognitive organization. The art in being alone, therefore, lies in transforming unstructured mental activity into directed reflection. This involves developing the capacity to observe thoughts without immediate identification, to distinguish between transient reactions and stable patterns. Over time, this observational stance creates distance between the individual and their own cognitive processes. This distance is critical. It allows for the recognition that thoughts are not identical to the self, but are events occurring within it. Such recognition introduces a form of internal autonomy, the ability to evaluate rather than simply experience one's own mental content. Solitude also alters the experience of time. In social environments, time is often segmented by external schedules, interactions, and obligations. Alone, these structures are reduced or removed, revealing a more continuous temporal flow. This can initially produce a sense of drift, but it also creates the possibility of temporal reconfiguration, organizing time according to internal priorities rather than external demands. This reconfiguration is not automatic. Without deliberate structure, time may fragment into unproductive intervals. The practice of solitude involves learning to impose meaningful rhythms, periods of reflection, activity, rest, aligned with cognitive and emotional states rather than imposed routines. Another dimension concerns attention. In the presence of others, attention is frequently divided, responding to multiple stimuli simultaneously. Solitude reduces external stimuli, making attention more available but also more volatile. Without clear direction, it may disperse across trivial or repetitive concerns. The development of attentional discipline becomes essential. This involves selecting objects of focus ideas, problems, observations, and maintaining engagement long enough to explore them in depth. Sustained attention transforms solitude from a passive state into an active cognitive environment. At the emotional level, solitude exposes dependencies that are less visible in social contexts. Feelings of validation, reassurance, or distraction that are often provided externally must be generated or managed internally. This can reveal areas where the individual relies heavily on external reinforcement. The recognition of such dependencies is not inherently negative. It provides information about the structure of one's emotional regulation. Solitude thus functions as a diagnostic condition, revealing patterns that might otherwise remain obscured. Importantly, the philosophy does not idealize solitude as universally beneficial. Its value depends on the individual's capacity to engage with it constructively. Without such capacity, solitude may amplify instability rather than resolve it. The practice, therefore, involves developing skills, attention, reflection, emotional regulation, that allow the condition to be used effectively. At a deeper level, solitude raises questions about self-sufficiency and relational necessity. Human beings are inherently social, yet they possess the capacity for independent cognition. The art of being alone explores the balance between these dimensions, seeking a form of independence that does not deny relational needs, but reduces dependence on constant external input. This balance leads to a redefinition of connection. Rather than being the default state required for stability, connection becomes a chosen interaction, engaged with from a position of internal coherence rather than necessity. Solitude, in this sense, does not replace social life, but recalibrates its significance. The initial stage of this philosophy, therefore, establishes solitude as a structured condition with specific cognitive, temporal, and emotional characteristics. It reframes aloneness from absence to presence, from deficiency to potential, and sets the foundation for deeper exploration into how the individual can inhabit this condition with increasing clarity and control. Once solitude is no longer interpreted as absence, but as a structured condition, the next phase of the art of being alone involves a more demanding process, direct confrontation with the self in the absence of distraction. If part I established solitude as a space, part II examines what emerges within that space when external noise is reduced. In social environments, distraction functions as a stabilizing mechanism. Conversation, media, and activity continuously redirect attention, preventing prolonged engagement with any single internal thread. Solitude removes much of this redirection, allowing underlying cognitive and emotional patterns to surface with greater persistence. This persistence is significant. Thoughts that would normally dissipate under shifting stimuli begin to repeat, extend, and connect. Patterns become visible, not as isolated events but as recurring structures. The individual is no longer encountering random thoughts, but observing the architecture of their own Arabic thou, Arabic ha, Arabic noon mind. The initial encounter with this architecture is often disorienting. Without interruption, unresolved concerns, anxieties, or contradictions may intensify. This is not because solitude creates them, but because it removes the mechanisms that conceal or diffuse them. What appears as an increase is often a shift in visibility. At this stage, the distinction between engagement and identification becomes critical. Engagement involves observing and analyzing internal content. Identification involves merging with it, treating each thought or emotion as definitive. Without deliberate separation, the individual risks being absorbed into reactive loops, cycles of thought that reinforce themselves without resolution. The practice of solitude requires developing a form of meta-awareness, the ability to recognize thoughts as objects of observation rather than unquestioned realities. This does not eliminate emotional intensity, but it introduces a layer of interpretation that can interrupt automatic responses. One of the central challenges here is the management of rumination. In the absence of external input, the mind may return repeatedly to specific concerns, attempting to resolve them through repetition rather than progression. Rumination differs from reflection in that it lacks structural development. It circles rather than advances. Transforming rumination into reflection involves introducing directionality. Instead of passively revisiting the same thought, the individual actively interrogates it, asking what assumptions it contains, what evidence supports it, and what alternatives exist. This shifts the process from repetition to analysis. Another dimension of this phase is the confrontation with internal contradiction. Social interaction often allows individuals to maintain separate, sometimes inconsistent perspectives without immediate tension. In solitude, these perspectives may collide, revealing inconsistencies that require reconciliation. Such confrontation can be destabilizing but also clarifying. It forces the individual to evaluate which beliefs are coherent and which are maintained through habit or external reinforcement. The result is a gradual movement toward internal consistency, though not necessarily simplicity. Solitude also alters the experience of emotional regulation. Without external reassurance or distraction, emotions must be processed internally. This can reveal whether one's regulation strategies are dependent on external input or supported by internal mechanisms. Developing internal regulation involves recognizing emotional states without immediate reaction, allowing them to stabilize before interpretation or action. This process requires patience and tolerance for discomfort, as it often involves remaining with unresolved states longer than is typical in socially mediated environments. A key insight at this stage is that the mind tends toward pattern reinforcement. Thoughts that are revisited frequently become more accessible, creating a feedback loop. Solitude makes this loop more visible, allowing the individual to either reinforce or interrupt it deliberately. Interrupting such loops does not require suppressing thought, but redirecting attention with intention. This might involve shifting focus to a different conceptual problem, engaging in structured reflection, or introducing external material selectively. The goal is not to eliminate internal activity, but to guide it. The role of silence becomes particularly important here. Silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is the reduction of external cognitive input, creating conditions in which internal processes dominate. Prolonged exposure to silence can initially amplify internal noise, but over time, it may lead to a more stable baseline of attention. This stabilization is not automatic. It depends on the individual's ability to remain engaged without seeking immediate escape. The impulse to reintroduce distraction through devices, tasks, or social contact is often strongest at this stage, as the discomfort of unfiltered awareness becomes more apparent. Resisting this impulse does not mean rejecting all forms of engagement, but rather choosing them deliberately. The art lies in distinguishing between engagement that supports clarity and distraction that avoids it. This distinction becomes a guiding principle for navigating solitude. Another aspect of this phase is the emergence of latent cognitive material, ideas, memories, or associations that are not immediately accessible in socially saturated contexts. Solitude creates the conditions for these elements to surface, often in non-linear ways. The challenge is to capture and organize this material without losing coherence. This may involve externalizing thought through writing or structured reflection to prevent it from dissipating. Externalization serves as a bridge between transient insight and stable understanding. Over time, the individual begins to recognize patterns not only in thought content, but in thinking processes themselves. How attention shifts, how associations form, how conclusions are reached. This meta-level awareness is a significant development, as it allows for the refinement of cognition rather than merely its observation. The cumulative effect of this phase is a movement from passive experience of thought to active engagement with its structure. Solitude becomes less about enduring the absence of others and more about interacting with the internal system that remains. This interaction is not necessarily comfortable, but it is informative. It reveals both strengths and limitations, areas of clarity and areas of confusion, stable beliefs and unresolved tensions. The individual gains a more detailed map of their own cognitive landscape. From this point, the philosophy advances toward a more constructive stage, not only observing and confronting internal structures, but reorganizing them, developing coherence, and establishing a more stable relationship between thought, emotion, and attention within the condition of being alone. Following the confrontation with internal patterns, the art of being alone transitions into a more constructive phase, the deliberate reorganization of thought, attention, and emotional structure. If earlier stages expose the architecture of the mind, this stage concerns how that architecture can be refined, stabilized, and made functional. Reorganization begins with the recognition that the mind is not a fixed entity but a modifiable system. Patterns of thought, whether productive or destructive, are reinforced through repetition and attention. Solitude provides the conditions to observe these patterns. It also provides the opportunity to intervene in their formation. The first step in this process is selection. Not all thoughts require equal attention. Some are transient, others structurally significant. The individual must learn to differentiate between noise and signal, between thoughts that contribute to understanding and those that merely occupy cognitive space. This differentiation is not intuitive. It requires criteria. Such criteria may include relevance, consistency, and alignment with observable reality. Over time, these standards form the basis of internal filtering, allowing the individual to allocate attention more efficiently. Attention, in this context, becomes a constructive force. What is attended to is reinforced. What is neglected tends to weaken. By consciously directing attention, the individual begins to reshape the distribution of cognitive activity, emphasizing clarity over confusion and structure over randomness. This leads to the development of internal coherence. Coherence does not imply uniformity or the absence of complexity, but rather the alignment of beliefs, interpretations, and responses into a system that is internally consistent. Contradictions are not ignored. They are identified and either resolved or clearly delineated. Achieving coherence requires sustained engagement. It involves revisiting beliefs, testing them against new information, and adjusting them when necessary. Solitude facilitates this process by reducing external interference, allowing for extended cycles of reflection and revision. A key aspect of this stage is the refinement of internal dialogue. The way individuals speak to themselves, how they frame questions, interpret events, and evaluate outcomes, shapes their cognitive environment. Unstructured or reactive internal dialogue can reinforce confusion, while structured dialogue can guide analysis. Structured internal dialogue involves asking precise questions, identifying assumptions, and following lines of reasoning to their logical conclusions. It transforms thought from a stream of reactions into a process of inquiry, where each step is connected to the next. This transformation also affects emotional experience. Emotions are not eliminated, but they become integrated into the cognitive system rather than operating independently of it. Instead of reacting immediately to emotional stimuli, the individual learns to interpret them, understanding their sources, triggers, and implications. Such integration enhances emotional stability. Stability does not mean the absence of fluctuation, but the presence of mechanisms that prevent escalation into disorder. Emotions are experienced, analyzed, and contextualized, reducing their capacity to disrupt overall coherence. Another critical development is the emergence of self-sufficiency in validation. In social contexts, validation is often external, opinions, feedback, or recognition from others. Solitude requires the individual to develop internal standards for evaluating their own thoughts and actions. This does not eliminate the value of external input, but it reduces dependence on it. The individual becomes capable of assessing correctness, consistency, and adequacy based on internal criteria. This shift is essential for maintaining coherence in the absence of constant external reference points. Self-sufficiency also extends to decision-making. Without immediate social input, decisions must be derived from internal reasoning processes. This increases the importance of having a structured framework for evaluation, identifying options, assessing consequences, and selecting based on defined priorities. The practice of making decisions in solitude strengthens cognitive autonomy. It reinforces the individual's capacity to act based on their own understanding, rather than defaulting to external guidance. Over time, this leads to greater confidence in one's reasoning processes. At the same time, solitude reveals the limits of autonomy. Complete self-sufficiency is neither possible nor desirable. Human cognition benefits from external perspectives. The goal is not isolation from influence, but the ability to engage with influence selectively, integrating it without losing internal coherence. This selective engagement requires the maintenance of boundaries. Boundaries are not physical but cognitive, criteria that determine which external inputs are accepted, which are questioned, and which are rejected. Solitude provides the space to establish and refine these criteria. The role of routine becomes more prominent at this stage. While earlier phases emphasized flexibility, reorganization benefits from structured repetition. Regular practices, periods of focused thought, reflection, or creative work, reinforce the patterns that support coherence. Routine, however, must remain adaptable. Rigid structures can become counterproductive if they prevent adjustment to new information or changing conditions. The objective is a dynamic structure, capable of maintaining stability while accommodating variation. Another outcome of this phase is the development of conceptual depth. With sustained attention and reduced distraction, individuals can explore ideas more thoroughly, examining their implications and connections. This depth contrasts with the superficial engagement typical of fragmented environments. Conceptual depth enhances the ability to synthesize information, integrating disparate elements into coherent frameworks. This synthesis is a key component of understanding, allowing the individual to move beyond isolated facts toward structured knowledge. Over time, the cumulative effect of these processes is the formation of a more integrated internal system. Thought, emotion, and attention operate in coordination, guided by principles that have been examined and refined. The individual is no longer reacting to internal activity but actively shaping it. This integration does not eliminate uncertainty or error. It provides a framework for addressing them, enabling correction and adaptation without loss of overall coherence. The system remains open, but it is no longer unstable. From this point, the philosophy advances toward examining how this internally coherent state interacts with the external world, how solitude, once developed as a structured condition, influences relationships, communication, and the re-entry into social environments without losing the autonomy that has been established. After the internal reorganization achieved through solitude, the art of being alone shifts toward a critical transition, re-engagement with others from a position of internal coherence. This stage examines how solitude reshapes not only the individual in isolation, but also the structure and quality of their relationships. The central transformation here is a change in dependency dynamics. Prior to developing solitude, social interaction often functions as a primary source of validation, distraction, and emotional regulation. After establishing internal stability, these functions are no longer exclusively external. Interaction becomes supplementary rather than foundational. This shift alters the motivation behind connection. Instead of seeking interaction to resolve internal instability, the individual engages from a position of relative self-sufficiency. Relationships are no longer driven primarily by need, but by alignment, shared values, mutual understanding, or intellectual compatibility. One immediate consequence is an increase in selectivity. When internal coherence is established, not all interactions contribute equally to stability or clarity. The individual becomes more attentive to the quality of engagement, whether it reinforces clarity or introduces confusion, whether it supports growth or maintains dependency. This selectivity is not inherently exclusionary. It reflects a recalibration of criteria for meaningful interaction. Superficial or repetitive exchanges may become less compelling, while conversations that involve depth, precision, or genuine exchange of ideas gain importance. At the same time, solitude introduces a clearer perception of social patterns. Behaviors that were previously normalized, habitual responses, unexamined assumptions, or reactive communication, become more visible when contrasted with the structured internal environment developed in isolation. This contrast can produce a form of cognitive dissonance. The individual may recognize inconsistencies or inefficiencies in social interaction that were previously unnoticed. Managing this dissonance requires balancing awareness with adaptability. Not all discrepancies need to be corrected, but they must be understood. Another key development is the refinement of communication. Solitude strengthens internal dialogue, which in turn influences external expression. Individuals who have clarified their own thinking tend to communicate with greater precision, reducing ambiguity and increasing coherence in interaction. This precision has two effects. First, it enhances the efficiency of communication, as ideas are conveyed more directly. Second, it can expose mismatches in interpretive frameworks between individuals, making misunderstandings more apparent. Such mismatches are not necessarily problematic, but they require recognition and adjustment. Emotional dynamics are also reconfigured. With increased internal regulation, the individual is less dependent on external responses to maintain stability. This reduces reactivity, allowing for more measured responses in interaction. Emotional exchanges become less about immediate reaction and more about contextual interpretation. This does not eliminate emotional engagement. It changes its structure. Emotions are experienced and expressed, but they are less likely to override cognitive evaluation. The result is a form of integrated interaction, where thought and emotion operate in coordination rather than conflict. A significant implication of this integration is the emergence of relational boundaries. Boundaries define the limits of acceptable influence, behavior, and engagement. In the absence of internal coherence, boundaries may be inconsistent or externally defined. Solitude allows for their deliberate construction based on internal criteria. These boundaries serve multiple functions. They protect the coherence developed in solitude, regulate the flow of external input, and establish conditions for reciprocal interaction. Relationships become more balanced, as influence is neither uncritically accepted nor reflexively rejected. However, the establishment of boundaries introduces challenges. It may alter existing relationships, particularly those that were structured around dependency or unexamined patterns. Adjusting these relationships requires negotiation and recalibration, both internally and externally. Another aspect of reentry is the recognition that solitude and connection are not mutually exclusive states. Rather than alternating between isolation and interaction, the individual can maintain elements of solitude within social contexts, preserving internal awareness while engaging externally. This capacity reflects a deeper integration. Solitude is no longer confined to physical separation. It becomes a cognitive condition that can persist across environments. The individual retains the ability to observe, evaluate, and regulate internal processes even in the presence of others. At the same time, engagement with others introduces new information and perspectives that can challenge internal coherence. This is not a regression, but a necessary component of continued development. External input provides opportunities to test, refine, and expand internal frameworks. The key is maintaining selective permeability, allowing new information to enter while evaluating it against established criteria. This prevents both rigidity, rejecting all external input, and instability, accepting all input uncritically. The balance between openness and stability becomes a central skill. Social environments also reintroduce complex temporal and attentional demands. Unlike solitude, where time and attention can be structured internally, interaction requires responsiveness to external cues. Managing this shift involves integrating internal rhythms with external expectations. This integration is not always seamless. The individual must adjust to varying contexts, maintaining coherence without imposing rigidity. Flexibility becomes as important as structure, allowing for adaptation without loss of clarity. Another outcome of this stage is a redefinition of presence. Presence is no longer merely physical participation, but involves attentional engagement and cognitive alignment. Being present in interaction requires both awareness of others and awareness of one's own internal state. This dual awareness enhances the quality of interaction. It allows for more accurate interpretation of signals, more deliberate responses, and a greater capacity for meaningful exchange. Presence becomes an active process rather than a passive condition. Over time, the interplay between solitude and connection leads to a more integrated mode of living. The individual is capable of functioning independently while engaging effectively with others, maintaining internal coherence without withdrawing from external complexity. This integration sets the stage for a deeper examination of how solitude influences not only interpersonal relationships, but also broader dimensions of life, purpose, creativity, and the construction of meaning within and beyond the individual. With internal coherence established and relational dynamics recalibrated, the art of being alone advances into a domain where solitude reveals one of its most productive functions: the generation of original thought and creative structure. This stage is not limited to artistic creativity. It encompasses any process in which the individual moves beyond repetition toward novel synthesis. Creativity in this framework is not treated as spontaneous inspiration, but as the outcome of conditions that allow ideas to develop without premature interruption. Social environments often favor rapid exchange and immediate response, which can truncate the development of complex or unconventional ideas. Solitude removes this pressure, allowing thought to extend beyond initial formulation. The absence of immediate feedback is critical. In social contexts, ideas are often evaluated quickly, accepted, rejected, or reshaped based on external reactions. Alone, the individual can suspend evaluation, allowing ideas to evolve through multiple iterations before being exposed to external critique. This suspension creates a space for conceptual risk-taking. Ideas that might appear incomplete, contradictory, or unconventional are not immediately discarded. Instead, they can be explored, refined, or combined with other elements. The threshold for dismissal is raised, increasing the likelihood of reaching less obvious conclusions. A key mechanism in this process is associative expansion. Without constant external direction, the mind can move laterally, connecting concepts that are not immediately related. These connections may initially seem arbitrary, but they often reveal underlying structures or generate new frameworks for understanding. However, associative expansion alone does not produce coherence. It must be balanced by selective consolidation, the process of organizing and refining ideas into structured forms. Without consolidation, creativity remains diffuse. With it, ideas acquire stability and communicability. Solitude supports this balance by allowing the individual to alternate between exploration and structuring without external interruption. Periods of open-ended thinking can be followed by periods of critical evaluation, creating a cycle that gradually transforms raw material into coherent output. Another important factor is the development of cognitive depth. Depth emerges when attention is sustained long enough to move beyond surface-level interpretation. In solitude, the absence of competing stimuli makes such sustained attention more feasible, enabling the individual to examine concepts in greater detail. Depth also facilitates the identification of implicit assumptions, elements of thought that are often taken for granted. By isolating and examining these assumptions, the individual can reconstruct ideas on more solid foundations, increasing both originality and rigor. The relationship between creativity and constraint becomes more apparent at this stage. While solitude provides freedom from external constraints, internal constraints, standards of coherence, relevance, and consistency become more significant. These constraints guide the creative process, preventing it from devolving into randomness. Effective creativity, therefore, involves the interplay between freedom and structure. Freedom allows for the generation of possibilities. Structure determines which possibilities are developed and retained. Solitude provides the environment in which this interplay can be managed deliberately. Emotional factors also play a role. Creativity often involves periods of uncertainty, where outcomes are not immediately clear. Solitude requires the individual to tolerate this uncertainty without external reassurance, maintaining engagement despite the absence of immediate validation. This tolerance contributes to the development of creative resilience, the ability to persist through ambiguity, revise incomplete ideas, and continue working without external reinforcement. Resilience ensures that the creative process is sustained long enough to produce meaningful results. Another dimension concerns the ownership of thought. In socially saturated environments, ideas are frequently influenced by prevailing trends, dominant narratives, or collective expectations. Solitude reduces these influences, allowing the individual to trace ideas more directly to their own cognitive processes. This does not guarantee originality, but it increases the likelihood that ideas are internally generated rather than externally replicated. The distinction becomes clearer as the individual learns to differentiate between inherited frameworks and those developed through independent analysis. The process of externalization becomes important at this stage. Ideas that remain internal are subject to distortion or loss. By expressing them, through writing, drawing, or other forms, the individual creates stable representations that can be revisited, evaluated, and refined. Externalization also introduces a form of delayed feedback. Once an idea is expressed, it can be examined as if it were external, allowing for more objective evaluation. This creates a feedback loop within the individual, partially substituting for social critique. Over time, the individual develops a personal methodology for creation, a set of practices that guide how ideas are generated, tested, and refined. This methodology is not fixed. It evolves with experience, adapting to different types of problems and objectives. Solitude also influences the tempo of creativity. Without external deadlines or interruptions, the pace can be adjusted to match the complexity of the task. Some ideas require rapid iteration, others benefit from extended incubation. The ability to modulate tempo enhances both efficiency and depth. Importantly, the creative output generated in solitude is not isolated from the external world. It is shaped by prior experiences, knowledge, and interaction. Solitude does not create ideas ex nihilo. It provides the conditions for recombining and restructuring existing elements into new configurations. The transition back to social contexts then becomes a phase of testing and integration, where internally developed ideas are exposed to external evaluation. This exposure can refine or challenge them, contributing to further development. At this stage, solitude is no longer merely a condition for self-understanding, but a productive environment for generating structured novelty. It enables the individual to move beyond passive consumption toward active creation, producing ideas that are both internally coherent and potentially valuable in broader contexts. From this point, the philosophical inquiry extends toward how sustained engagement with solitude influences long-term orientation, how it shapes purpose, values, and the construction of a life that integrates independence, creativity, and meaningful engagement with the world. As the art of being alone progresses beyond creativity, it reaches a structural question: how sustained solitude reshapes one's sense of direction, purpose, and long-term orientation. If earlier stages established internal coherence and the capacity for independent thought, this stage concerns how those capacities are organized into a stable trajectory. Purpose in this framework is not treated as a fixed objective waiting to be discovered, but as a constructed orientation, a system of priorities that guides decision-making over time. Social environments often provide ready-made frameworks for purpose, derived from cultural expectations, norms, or collective narratives. Solitude reduces the influence of these frameworks, exposing the individual to the task of defining direction without immediate external templates. This exposure can initially produce uncertainty. Without predefined paths, the range of possible directions expands, but so does the difficulty of selection. The individual must move from inherited purpose to constructed purpose, a transition that requires evaluation rather than adoption. The process begins with identifying value structures. Values determine what is considered important, desirable, or meaningful. In socially mediated contexts, values are often absorbed implicitly. Solitude allows them to be examined explicitly, questioned, compared, and reorganized. This examination reveals that values are not always internally consistent. Conflicts may exist between short-term preferences and long-term objectives, between individual goals and relational commitments. Resolving these conflicts is essential for establishing coherent direction, as inconsistent values lead to fragmented decision-making. Once values are clarified, they function as selection criteria. Decisions are evaluated based on their alignment with these criteria, reducing arbitrariness and increasing consistency over time. Purpose, therefore, emerges not as a single goal but as a pattern of aligned choices. Solitude plays a critical role in maintaining this alignment. In the absence of constant external influence, decisions can be evaluated against internal standards rather than immediate social feedback. This reduces the tendency toward reactive or externally driven choices, reinforcing self-directed behavior. Another important dimension is the relationship between short-term action and long-term orientation. Without deliberate structuring, immediate concerns can dominate attention, leading to decisions that are locally effective but globally inconsistent. Solitude allows for periodic disengagement from immediate demands, creating space to evaluate whether current actions align with broader objectives. This evaluation requires the ability to simulate future outcomes, to anticipate how current decisions will influence long-term trajectories. Such simulation is cognitively demanding, as it involves uncertainty and incomplete information. However, it is essential for maintaining direction over extended periods. The concept of temporal integration becomes central. Past experiences, present conditions, and future possibilities must be connected into a coherent framework. Solitude facilitates this integration by providing uninterrupted time for reflection, allowing the individual to construct narratives that link these temporal dimensions. These narratives are not static, they are revised as new information emerges. The individual develops a dynamic sense of purpose, capable of adaptation without losing overall coherence. This adaptability is critical, as rigid adherence to outdated objectives can be as destabilizing as the absence of direction. At this stage, solitude also reveals the distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is driven by external rewards or recognition. Intrinsic motivation arises from internal interest or alignment with values. Solitude reduces the immediate influence of external rewards, making intrinsic factors more visible. This visibility allows the individual to evaluate whether their activities are internally meaningful or externally conditioned. Over time, a shift toward intrinsic motivation can occur, leading to more sustainable engagement, as actions are driven by internal alignment rather than external validation. However, intrinsic motivation is not automatically stable. It must be supported by structured engagement, clear objectives, feedback mechanisms, and consistent effort. Without such structure, even intrinsically meaningful activities may lose momentum. Another aspect of this phase is the development of strategic thinking. Purpose requires not only identifying goals but determining how to achieve them. This involves analyzing constraints, allocating resources, and sequencing actions. Solitude provides the environment for such analysis, free from immediate external pressures. Strategic thinking introduces a layer of abstraction, moving from individual decisions to systems of action. The individual begins to consider not only what to do, but how different actions interact over time. This systemic perspective enhances efficiency and reduces redundancy. At the same time, the individual must manage the tension between planning and adaptability. Overplanning can reduce flexibility, while insufficient planning can lead to inefficiency. Solitude allows for iterative adjustment. Plans are developed, tested, and revised based on new information. The role of discipline becomes more pronounced. Self-directed life construction requires consistent execution, not only conceptual clarity. Discipline ensures that actions align with intentions over time, bridging the gap between planning and implementation. Discipline, however, is not merely rigidity. It involves the ability to maintain engagement despite fluctuations in motivation, adapting methods while preserving direction. Solitude strengthens discipline by reducing external variability, allowing for more controlled environments of action. Another outcome of this stage is a redefinition of success. In socially driven contexts, success is often measured by external indicators, status, recognition, or comparison with others. In solitude, these indicators lose immediacy, and success becomes linked to internal criteria, alignment with values, coherence of action, and progress towards self-defined objectives. This redefinition does not eliminate external metrics, but places them within a broader framework. External achievements are evaluated in terms of their contribution to internal coherence, rather than as ends in themselves. Over time, the integration of values, strategy, and disciplined action produces a self-directed system. The individual is capable of generating, evaluating, and executing plans without relying on continuous external guidance. This system is not isolated from the world, but interacts with it on more deliberate terms. The culmination of this stage is not a fixed purpose, but a stable orientation, a consistent way of navigating choices, adapting to change, and maintaining coherence across time. Solitude functions as both the environment in which this orientation is constructed and the mechanism through which it is maintained. From this point, The philosophical inquiry extends toward examining how this self-directed orientation interacts with uncertainty, limitation, and the broader conditions of existence. How individuals sustain purpose and coherence in the presence of unpredictability and constraint. At this stage of the art of being alone, the focus shifts toward a more fundamental condition: how the internally constructed system responds when confronted with uncertainty, limitation, and the uncontrollable aspects of reality. If previous stages established coherence and direction, this phase tests their durability under conditions that cannot be fully managed or predicted. Uncertainty is not an occasional disturbance. It is a structural feature of existence. Outcomes cannot be guaranteed, information is always incomplete, and external conditions remain partially beyond control. In socially mediated environments, uncertainty is often diffused, shared across groups, softened by collective interpretation, or masked by routine. In solitude, it becomes more direct and less mediated. The immediate effect of this exposure is a confrontation with the limits of predictive control. Even with well-structured plans and coherent reasoning, outcomes may diverge from expectations. This divergence challenges the assumption that clarity and discipline alone are sufficient to ensure stability. The philosophical shift here involves moving from control-based orientation to stability-based orientation. Control focuses on shaping external outcomes. Stability focuses on maintaining internal coherence regardless of those outcomes. Solitude enables this shift by reducing reliance on external validation and emphasizing internal consistency as the primary reference point. This does not imply abandoning action or planning. Rather, it involves recognizing that the value of action lies partly in its alignment with internal structure, not solely in its external success. Decisions are evaluated not only by results, but by whether they reflect coherent reasoning and consistent values. Limitation plays a central role in this process. Cognitive, emotional, and temporal resources are finite. The individual cannot pursue all possibilities, resolve all uncertainties, or maintain constant clarity. Solitude makes these limits more visible, as there are fewer external buffers to compensate for them. Recognizing limitation introduces the need for prioritization. Attention and effort must be allocated selectively, focusing on areas that align most closely with established values and objectives. This selective allocation enhances efficiency, but also requires accepting that some areas will remain unresolved or underdeveloped. Acceptance in this context is not passive resignation but accurate recognition of constraints. It involves distinguishing between what can be influenced and what cannot, and adjusting expectations accordingly. This reduces the cognitive strain associated with attempting to control uncontrollable variables. Another dimension of uncertainty concerns ambiguity in interpretation. Not all situations provide clear signals. Evidence may be incomplete or conflicting. Solitude requires the individual to operate within this ambiguity without immediate external clarification. The capacity to function under ambiguity depends on tolerance for indeterminacy, the ability to hold multiple possibilities in consideration without premature closure. This tolerance prevents the adoption of oversimplified explanations that provide certainty at the cost of accuracy. At the same time, indefinite suspension of judgment is not sustainable. The individual must develop criteria for provisional decision-making, acting based on the best available information while remaining open to revision. This introduces a dynamic relationship between commitment and flexibility. Emotional responses to uncertainty are also significant. Uncertainty can generate anxiety, particularly when outcomes have meaningful consequences. In solitude, this anxiety cannot be immediately diffused through external reassurance, requiring the development of internal regulation strategies. These strategies involve recognizing emotional responses without allowing them to dictate interpretation or action. Emotions provide information about perceived risk or significance, but they must be integrated with cognitive evaluation to produce balanced decisions. Over time, the repeated navigation of uncertainty leads to the formation of an inner ground, a stable reference point that persists despite changing external conditions. This ground is not based on certainty about outcomes, but on confidence in one's processes of reasoning, evaluation, and adaptation. The concept of inner ground is central. It represents a shift from seeking stability in the external environment to establishing it within the structure of cognition and value. External conditions may fluctuate, but the internal framework remains sufficiently coherent to absorb variation without disintegration. This internal stability enhances resilience. Resilience is not the absence of disruption, but the capacity to recover coherence after disruption occurs. Solitude strengthens resilience by repeatedly exposing the individual to conditions that require self-regulation and adaptive response. Another important aspect is the recalibration of expectation. Expectations that are overly rigid or unrealistic can amplify the impact of uncertainty. By aligning expectations with the recognition of limitation and variability, the individual reduces the discrepancy between anticipated and actual outcomes. This recalibration supports a more sustainable engagement with long-term objectives. Goals are pursued with commitment, but without the assumption that progress will be linear or predictable. This allows for adjustment without loss of direction. Solitude also influences the perception of risk. Without immediate social feedback, the individual must evaluate risk independently, considering both potential outcomes and their alignment with values. This evaluation becomes more nuanced, as it is less influenced by collective reactions and more by internal criteria. The development of nuanced risk assessment contributes to strategic flexibility. The individual can adapt approaches based on changing conditions while maintaining consistency in underlying objectives. Flexibility is guided, not arbitrary. At this stage, the integration of uncertainty and limitation into the internal system produces a more robust form of coherence. The system no longer depends on stable external conditions to function effectively. It incorporates variability as a normal element rather than an exception. This incorporation does not eliminate difficulty. Uncertainty remains challenging, and limitations persist. What changes is the individual's relationship to these factors. They are no longer sources of destabilization, but parameters within which coherence is maintained. From this point, the philosophy moves toward examining how this stabilized internal ground interacts with broader existential questions. How solitude informs one's understanding of meaning, existence, and the position of the individual within a larger, often indifferent or unpredictable reality. At this stage, the art of being alone extends beyond cognition, structure, and adaptation into a more fundamental inquiry. How solitude reshapes the individual's understanding of existence and meaning itself. With internal coherence established and stabilized against uncertainty, the question is no longer how to think or act, but how to situate oneself within reality as a whole. Meaning, in socially saturated environments, is often externally scaffolded. Cultural narratives, collective goals, and shared values provide ready-made frameworks that assign significance to actions and experiences. These frameworks reduce ambiguity by embedding the individual within a larger structure of interpretation. Solitude removes or weakens these scaffolds. Without constant reinforcement from external narratives, meaning is no longer passively received. It becomes something that must be actively constructed or recognized. This shift can initially produce a sense of indeterminacy, as familiar reference points lose their immediacy. The absence of imposed meaning does not imply the absence of meaning altogether. Rather, it reveals that meaning is not an inherent property of events, but a relational structure, emerging from how experiences are interpreted, connected, and integrated within a broader framework. In solitude, this relational process becomes more visible. The individual observes how significance is assigned, why certain experiences are emphasized, how patterns are formed, and how narratives are constructed. Meaning is no longer assumed. It is examined as a process. This examination introduces a distinction between inherited meaning and constructed meaning. Inherited meaning derives from external systems, traditions, institutions, or collective beliefs. Constructed meaning arises from internal alignment, values, coherence, and deliberate interpretation. Neither form is inherently superior. Inherited frameworks provide efficiency and shared understanding. Constructed frameworks provide autonomy and adaptability. The art lies in integrating both without becoming entirely dependent on either. Solitude facilitates this integration by allowing the individual to decompose inherited structures, identifying which elements are coherent and which are maintained through habit or unexamined acceptance. This decomposition creates the possibility of reconstruction on more deliberate terms. At a deeper level, solitude confronts the individual with the neutrality of existence. The world does not inherently provide guarantees of meaning, fairness, or coherence. Events occur according to complex and often indifferent processes. Recognizing this neutrality can be destabilizing, as it removes implicit assumptions about order or purpose. However, this recognition also creates a form of conceptual clarity. By separating what is from what is interpreted, the individual avoids projecting unwarranted structure onto reality. Meaning is then understood as a human construction, grounded in interpretation rather than imposed by the external world. This does not reduce meaning to arbitrariness. Constructed meaning can still be constrained by internal coherence and external reality. Interpretations must remain consistent and compatible with observable conditions. The individual operates within these constraints, balancing freedom with accuracy. Another dimension concerns the experience of existential scale. In solitude, without constant social reference, the individual may become more aware of their position within larger systems, temporal, spatial, and causal. This awareness can produce a sense of insignificance, but also a clearer understanding of proportion. This recalibration of scale affects how significance is assigned. Events that once appeared central may be recontextualized, while smaller, previously overlooked elements may gain importance. Meaning becomes less dependent on magnitude and more on alignment with internal structure. The concept of alignment becomes central. Meaning is experienced not as an external validation, but as a state of coherence between action, value, and understanding. When these elements align, actions feel purposeful regardless of external recognition or scale. Solitude strengthens this alignment by reducing interference. Without constant external input, the individual can evaluate whether actions correspond to internal values without immediate distortion. This creates a more stable basis for meaning that is less susceptible to fluctuation. At the same time, the absence of external reinforcement introduces a challenge, sustaining meaning without continuous validation. In social contexts, meaning is often reinforced through feedback, recognition, agreement, or shared interpretation. In solitude, this reinforcement must be internal. This requires a stable internal framework capable of self-reinforcement. The individual must be able to recognize coherence and value within their own system, independent of external acknowledgement. This does not eliminate the value of external validation, but it reduces dependence on it. Another aspect of this stage is the role of silence. Silence, extended over time, shifts from being merely the absence of sound to a background condition of existence. Within this silence, thought, perception, and awareness become more distinct. Silence allows for the observation of minimal structures, basic patterns of attention, perception, and interpretation that underlie more complex processes. These structures are often obscured in noisy environments but become accessible in sustained solitude. Engagement with these minimal structures can lead to a more refined understanding of consciousness itself, not in abstract theoretical terms, but as a direct experience of how awareness operates. This experience contributes to a deeper form of stability, as the individual becomes less dependent on external content for orientation. At this level, solitude reveals that meaning is not solely derived from external achievement or narrative construction. It can also emerge from the quality of awareness itself, the clarity, coherence, and precision with which experience is perceived and interpreted. This perspective does not negate action or purpose, it reframes them. Actions are not only means to achieve external outcomes but also expressions of internal alignment. Purpose is not only a destination, but a mode of engagement with reality. Over time, this leads to a more integrated understanding of existence. The individual operates within a reality that is neither inherently meaningful nor meaningless, but structured in such a way that meaning can be constructed through coherent interaction. Solitude thus becomes not only a condition for self-development, but a framework for existential orientation. It provides the conditions under which the individual can examine, construct, and sustain meaning without relying exclusively on external systems. From this point, the philosophical exploration extends toward how this understanding of meaning and existence influences long-term engagement with life, how individuals act, create, and relate within a reality that offers no guarantees but allows for structured, coherent participation. At this stage, the art of being alone moves from philosophical understanding to sustained application. The question is no longer how solitude transforms cognition, meaning, or identity in isolated conditions, but how these transformations are maintained over time within the full complexity of lived experience. A central issue emerges: continuity. Insights developed in solitude, clarity, coherence, internal alignment are not self-preserving. Without reinforcement, they degrade under the pressure of routine, distraction, and external demands. The challenge is to convert temporary states into stable patterns of operation. This conversion requires the establishment of practice. Practice, in this context, is not repetition for its own sake, but the deliberate re-engagement with the conditions that produce clarity. It functions as a mechanism for stabilizing internal structures across changing environments. Practice operates on multiple levels. At the cognitive level, it involves regular periods of undisturbed thought, where attention can return to extended analysis rather than fragmented processing. At the emotional level, it involves maintaining regulatory awareness, ensuring that responses remain integrated rather than reactive. At the structural level, it involves reinforcing alignment between action and values. One of the primary threats to continuity is environmental resaturation. As individuals re-engage with complex social and technological systems, the density of input increases. Without deliberate boundaries, this input can reintroduce fragmentation, dispersing attention and weakening coherence. The management of input becomes a critical skill. This does not require complete withdrawal but selective filtration, determining which information is relevant, which is noise, and how much can be processed without compromising clarity. Filtration preserves the integrity of internal systems while allowing engagement with external complexity. Another challenge is temporal fragmentation. Modern environments often divide time into short, discontinuous intervals, reducing opportunities for sustained reflection. Maintaining continuity requires the intentional creation of extended temporal blocks where thought can develop without interruption. These temporal structures function as anchors, re-establishing the conditions necessary for depth. Without them, cognition defaults to surface-level processing, and the benefits of solitude diminish. At the same time, continuity depends on integration rather than separation. Solitude cannot remain an isolated practice disconnected from daily life. Its principles, attention, coherence, deliberate evaluation, must be applied within action, not only outside it. This integration involves carrying elements of solitude into activity, maintaining internal observation during interaction, preserving clarity under pressure, and applying structured thinking to real-time decisions. Solitude becomes a portable framework, not a separate state. A key component of this portability is attentional control. The ability to direct and sustain attention in varied environments determines whether internal coherence can be maintained. Without control, attention is captured by external stimuli, leading to reactive rather than deliberate engagement. Attentional control is reinforced through repeated application. Each instance of deliberate focus strengthens the underlying capacity, while each instance of uncontrolled distraction weakens it. Over time, these patterns accumulate, shaping the baseline state of cognition. Another dimension of practice is periodic recalibration. Even with consistent application, drift occurs, values may shift, priorities may change, and external conditions may alter constraints. Regular intervals of solitude allow for reassessment, ensuring that the internal system remains aligned with current realities. Recalibration prevents rigidity. Without it, systems that were once coherent may become outdated, leading to misalignment between intention and action. The process involves reviewing assumptions, updating frameworks, and adjusting strategies accordingly. The concept of maintenance effort becomes central. Coherence is not a one-time achievement but a condition that must be actively sustained. This effort is not constant in intensity, but it must be consistent in presence. Neglect leads to gradual erosion, often unnoticed until fragmentation becomes significant. Another aspect concerns the relationship between efficiency and depth. In practical environments, efficiency is often prioritized. Tasks must be completed quickly, decisions made rapidly. Solitude emphasizes depth, which can appear slower. The integration of both requires distinguishing when depth is necessary and when efficiency is sufficient. This distinction allows for adaptive allocation of cognitive resources. Complex problems receive extended attention. Routine tasks are handled efficiently. The ability to switch between these modes without losing coherence is a marker of advanced integration. Solitude also influences the perception of progress. In externally driven systems, progress is often measured by visible outcomes. In internally structured systems, progress includes improvements in clarity, stability, and alignment, changes that may not be immediately observable but are structurally significant. Recognizing these forms of progress is essential for maintaining motivation. Without acknowledgement of internal development, the individual may default to external metrics, undermining the autonomy established through solitude. Another challenge arises from social misalignment. Not all environments support the practices associated with solitude. Expectations for constant availability, rapid response, or conformity may conflict with the need for reflection and selective engagement. Navigating this misalignment requires strategic compromise. The individual must determine where to adapt and where to maintain boundaries, balancing participation with preservation of internal structure. This balance is context-dependent and requires ongoing evaluation. Over time, consistent practice leads to the formation of a stable operating system, a set of habits, structures, and criteria that guide cognition and action across contexts. This system is not rigid. It evolves with experience, but it maintains a core orientation toward clarity and coherence. The presence of such a system reduces cognitive load. Decisions become more efficient because they are guided by established frameworks. Uncertainty is managed more effectively because the processes for addressing it are familiar. Importantly, this stability does not eliminate variability in experience. External conditions remain unpredictable, and internal states may fluctuate. What changes is the individual's ability to absorb variation without losing structural integrity. At this stage, solitude is no longer an occasional practice, but a continuous influence embedded within daily life. It shapes how information is processed, how decisions are made, and how meaning is constructed in real time. The philosophical trajectory now turns toward a broader synthesis. How this integrated system interacts with the wider world over extended periods, how it influences legacy, long-term impact, and the relationship between individual coherence and collective complexity. At this stage, the art of being alone extends beyond the internal system and its maintenance toward a broader question: how a self-directed, internally coherent individual relates to larger collective structures over time. The focus shifts from personal stability to scale, how individual clarity interacts with social complexity, and what forms of influence or limitation emerge from that interaction. The first consideration is that internally constructed coherence does not exist in isolation from collective systems. Every individual operates within networks, social, cultural, economic, whose dynamics are shaped by multiple agents with varying levels of alignment and coherence. The challenge is to determine how an internally stable system can function within externally unstable or heterogeneous environments. A key distinction arises between local coherence and global incoherence. An individual may achieve a high degree of internal alignment, yet operate within systems characterized by contradiction, inefficiency, or competing values. This creates a structural tension, whether to adapt to the system, attempt to influence it, or maintain selective distance. Solitude prepares the individual for this tension by strengthening independence of evaluation. Decisions are not derived solely from collective norms but from internal criteria. This allows for more deliberate engagement, but it also introduces friction when internal and external frameworks diverge. The concept of influence becomes central. Influence is not limited to overt authority. It includes the capacity to affect interpretation, behavior, or structure through action, communication, or example. The question is how influence can be exerted without compromising internal coherence. One approach is through precision of contribution. Rather than attempting to reshape entire systems, the individual focuses on specific domains where clarity can be applied effectively. Contributions are targeted, consistent with internal values, and designed to integrate into existing structures without unnecessary distortion. This approach recognizes the limits of scale. Large systems are resistant to rapid change, particularly when they are composed of diverse and sometimes conflicting elements. Attempting to impose coherence at a scale beyond one's capacity can lead to inefficiency or loss of alignment. At the same time, small-scale contributions can accumulate. When multiple agents operate with internal coherence, their interactions may produce localized zones of stability, which can influence broader patterns over time. The effect is indirect but not negligible. Another dimension concerns visibility and recognition. In collective environments, visibility often determines perceived impact. However, visibility is influenced by factors that may not align with internal coherence, such as popularity, conformity, or amplification mechanisms. Solitude recalibrates the importance of visibility. Impact is evaluated not only by how widely actions are recognized, but by how effectively they align with internal criteria and contribute to structural clarity, regardless of scale. This reduces dependence on external validation while preserving the possibility of meaningful contribution. The concept of legacy emerges in this context. Legacy is not limited to material outcomes or public recognition. It includes the persistence of ideas, structures, or patterns initiated by the individual. Solitude influences how legacy is conceptualized, shifting focus from external acknowledgement to long-term coherence and transferability of insight. Transferability requires that ideas be articulated and externalized in forms that can be understood and applied by others. This introduces a new challenge, translating internally coherent frameworks into communicable structures without oversimplification or distortion. Communication at scale involves compromise. Concepts must be adapted to different levels of understanding and varying contexts. The individual must balance fidelity to internal structure with accessibility, ensuring that ideas remain accurate while becoming usable. Another aspect of scale is the interaction between individual autonomy and collective coordination. While solitude emphasizes independence, collective systems require some degree of coordination, shared norms, synchronized actions, or common frameworks. The integration of autonomy and coordination depends on the ability to align selectively. The individual participates in collective processes where alignment exists and maintains independence where it does not. This selective alignment preserves coherence while enabling participation. Over time, this approach leads to the formation of networked coherence, connections between individuals who operate with similar internal structures. These networks do not require uniformity. They function through compatibility of principles rather than identical beliefs. Networked coherence can enhance resilience at a larger scale. When multiple agents maintain clarity and alignment, their interactions can stabilize local systems, even if broader environments remain variable. The effect is distributed rather than centralized. However, the individual must also confront the limits of influence. Not all systems can be altered, and not all contributions will produce visible effects. Solitude prepares the individual to act without guaranteed impact, maintaining alignment regardless of outcome. This orientation reduces frustration associated with uncontrollable variables. Action is guided by internal criteria rather than contingent on external success. The value of contribution lies in its coherence, not solely in its reception. Another dimension concerns the ethical implications of scale. As influence increases, the consequences of action extend beyond the individual. Decisions must account for broader effects, including unintended consequences. This requires integrating systemic awareness into the decision-making process. Systemic awareness involves understanding how actions interact with existing structures, how they may propagate through networks, and how they may be interpreted by others. Solitude provides the environment for developing this awareness, but application occurs within collective contexts. The relationship between consistency and adaptation becomes more complex at scale. Maintaining internal coherence is essential, but rigid application may be ineffective in diverse environments. Adaptation must occur without compromising core principles, requiring context-sensitive interpretation. Over extended periods, the interaction between individual coherence and collective complexity produces a dynamic equilibrium. The individual contributes to the system while being influenced by it, maintaining a degree of independence within interdependence. This equilibrium is not static. It evolves as conditions change, requiring ongoing evaluation and adjustment. Solitude remains a reference point, a mechanism for recalibrating alignment and reassessing direction in relation to broader systems. At this stage, The philosophy integrates the individual and the collective into a single framework. Solitude is no longer an isolated practice, but a foundational process that informs engagement at all scales, from personal decision-making to participation in complex social systems. The exploration now extends toward the final dimension of this trajectory: how sustained engagement with solitude shapes the overall arc of a life, how coherence, purpose, and interaction accumulate across time to form a unified, continuously evolving structure of existence. At this stage, the focus shifts from the interaction of the individual with collective structures toward the dimension of time itself. Solitude, having shaped internal coherence and refined the capacity for selective engagement, becomes the medium through which a life is ordered, sustained, and extended. The individual begins to perceive patterns not only in space, but across temporal layers, recognizing how actions, reflections, and choices accumulate into enduring structures. Temporal continuity does not imply repetition or rigidity. Rather, it manifests as an evolving lattice of selfhood, in which each moment is connected to the preceding one through the preservation of principles and alignment of values. Past experiences are not merely recalled, they are integrated, interpreted, and woven into frameworks that inform present understanding. Likewise, future possibilities are not abstracted but projected through the lens of internal coherence, guiding decisions in ways that preserve alignment while accommodating change. Solitude cultivates the capacity to inhabit this temporal depth. Through sustained reflection, the individual internalizes the consequences of action, traces the propagation of influence, and discerns the emergent patterns of cause and effect. Decisions are no longer isolated occurrences. They are nodes within an ongoing, self-consistent structure. The individual acts with awareness of cumulative impact, understanding that coherence over time amplifies both insight and influence, even when immediate effects are imperceptible. As years unfold, the accumulation of deliberate practice, reflection, and measured engagement produces a compounding effect. Small, precise actions, when aligned with internal criteria, generate persistent influence within social, intellectual, and structural systems. Legacy is thus redefined. It is less the outcome recognized externally and more the endurance of principles, patterns, and structures initiated by coherent action. The individual's presence becomes a thread running through temporal networks, shaping them subtly yet persistently. Solitude also transforms perception of time itself. Rather than experiencing it as a sequence of contingencies or reactive pressures, the individual inhabits a temporally coherent field, observing connections between past, present, and potential future. Insight emerges not from isolated reflection, but from the integration of experiences across time, producing a sense of continuity that informs both judgment and action. The architecture of life, in this sense, is not imposed externally, but emerges from sustained internal coherence. Habits, practices, and decisions accumulate into patterns that are legible to the self, if not always to others. The life of the solitary individual becomes a structured system, in which each phase contributes to the integrity of the whole while remaining adaptable to the unpredictability of external circumstances. Through this temporal lens, the relationship between solitude, coherence, and engagement deepens. Actions are undertaken with awareness of their longitudinal effects. Influence is measured across years rather than moments, and reflection is oriented toward the formation of enduring structures. The individual navigates existence not only as a participant in immediate networks, but as a custodian of continuity, whose internal clarity anchors both action and understanding across the unfolding span of life. With temporal depth established, the exploration turns toward the qualitative dimensions of existence: the ethical, the aesthetic, and the ways in which internal coherence shapes perception, judgment, and engagement. Solitude, having provided clarity of self and stability of internal structure, now enables the individual to discern subtle patterns of value, consequence, and resonance across both action and experience. Ethical awareness emerges naturally from sustained reflection and the observation of accumulated effects. Decisions are no longer guided solely by external rules, expedience, or immediate approval, but by the internalized structures of integrity, responsibility, and awareness cultivated through solitude. The individual perceives the ripple of each choice, understanding that even small actions can propagate through networks of relationships, social systems, and cultural frameworks. Ethical clarity is not imposed from without. It arises from the consistent alignment of thought, action, and consequence, producing a principled orientation toward the world. Aesthetic sensibility evolves in parallel. Exposure to silence and depth sharpens perception of harmony, proportion, and nuance, extending beyond art or beauty into the experience of living itself. The individual begins to recognize patterns of dissonance and consonance within actions, systems, and interactions, developing an intuitive sense for what aligns with coherence and what disrupts it. This sensibility informs both creation and judgment, guiding not only what is produced but how it is experienced, appreciated, and transmitted. Solitude enhances the capacity to integrate ethical and aesthetic perception into a coherent practice of living. Choices are made with sensitivity to both the integrity of internal structures and their expression in the external world. The individual becomes attentive to the interplay between principle and effect, pattern and impact, recognizing that life itself can be approached as a work of deliberate composition. Each decision, each engagement, each form of expression is calibrated for alignment, continuity, and resonance. This integration fosters a kind of internal harmony that is resilient yet responsive. The individual navigates complexity not by rigid adherence to rules or by passive accommodation to circumstance, but through the continuous application of coherent frameworks that balance integrity, adaptability, and perceptual acuity. Solitude, once a condition of withdrawal, now functions as a mechanism of refinement, enabling the cultivation of life as a structured, deliberate, and meaningful system. Ethics, aesthetics, and coherence intersect in the recognition that influence and action carry weight over time. The individual's capacity to shape experience, directly or indirectly, is amplified through the combination of clarity, discernment, and patience. Impact is measured not merely by immediate effect, but by alignment with enduring principles, the resonance of action within networks, and the capacity for structural persistence. Solitude ensures that such influence is exercised without compromise of integrity, maintaining fidelity to the internal compass, even amid external pressures or shifting contexts. As the architecture of life unfolds through temporal depth, ethical clarity, and aesthetic discernment, the individual inevitably confronts the inescapable condition of uncertainty. Solitude, which has cultivated internal coherence and self-directed structure, now becomes the vantage point from which the unpredictable and impermanent nature of existence can be observed, understood, and integrated into the practice of living. Uncertainty is not merely a contingency to be endured, it is a structural reality of complex systems. Social networks, ecological environments, intellectual landscapes, and even the self are subject to constant flux. The external world is rarely aligned with the internal lattice of coherence. Solitude equips the individual to navigate this tension by fostering independence of evaluation, a capacity to act without total reliance on predictable outcomes, and a resilient orientation that privileges clarity over convenience. Impermanence, the temporal corollary to uncertainty, transforms perception of action and legacy. The individual recognizes that nothing, relationships, achievements, structures, or influence, is entirely permanent. Yet, rather than producing despair or detachment, this recognition deepens engagement. It clarifies priorities, refines judgment, and shapes the manner in which effort is directed. Actions are undertaken not for the sake of permanence alone, but for alignment with enduring principles and the coherent projection of intention across temporal scales. In this context, adaptive creativity becomes a necessary complement to solitude. Creativity is no longer a romanticized expression of novelty. It is a disciplined capacity to respond to uncertainty with insight and precision. The individual learns to generate solutions, interpretations, and forms that are both internally coherent and externally responsive, able to navigate complex and shifting circumstances without sacrificing structural integrity. Each creative act is an experiment in alignment, a calibration between the stable internal system and the variable external environment. Adaptive creativity operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the level of thought, it allows the individual to reconceptualize problems, to reframe constraints as opportunities, and to envision pathways that might not be immediately visible. On the level of action, it guides experimentation in behavior, communication, and intervention, ensuring that engagement remains deliberate and coherent even when outcomes are uncertain. On the level of interaction with collective systems, it enables contributions that are sensitive to context, scalable within existing structures, and minimally disruptive while maximizing clarity and alignment. The practice of adaptive creativity relies on continuous feedback, both internal and external. Solitude provides the internal feedback loop, reflection, observation, and recalibration of principles in light of new understanding. Engagement with the external world provides the systemic feedback loop, observation of consequences, detection of emergent patterns, and adjustment of actions in response to dynamic forces. The synthesis of these feedback mechanisms allows for a life that is both principled and flexible, coherent yet responsive, deliberate yet open to the unforeseen. Uncertainty also shapes the conception of risk and responsibility. Decisions made under incomplete information or within volatile systems are evaluated not solely for immediate efficacy, but for alignment with enduring structures and ethical principles. Solitude strengthens the capacity to tolerate ambiguity without surrendering coherence, to act decisively even when outcomes cannot be fully predicted, and to maintain integrity when external validation or recognition is delayed, diminished, or absent. Impermanence further informs the understanding of influence. The individual recognizes that impact is rarely absolute, often indirect, and frequently deferred. Actions ripple across temporal and relational networks, creating zones of effect whose significance may not be immediately apparent. Solitude allows the individual to maintain commitment to contribution, even in the absence of immediate feedback, cultivating patience and sustained attention to long-term coherence rather than short-term acclaim. The interplay between uncertainty, impermanence, and adaptive creativity generates a distinctive mode of engagement with life, one that balances initiative with observation, planning with responsiveness, and principle with flexibility. The individual learns to navigate the shifting boundaries between what can be controlled, what can be influenced, and what must be observed and accommodated. This navigational skill is neither passive nor reactive. It is an ongoing, deliberate practice of alignment within flux. At a higher level, the integration of uncertainty and impermanence reshapes the understanding of meaning itself. Meaning is no longer conceived as a static or externally conferred attribute, but as a dynamic pattern emerging from the interplay of action, reflection, and consequence over time. Solitude cultivates the perceptual capacity to detect these patterns, to recognize coherence within apparent chaos, and to act in ways that reinforce structural integrity and resonance. The individual perceives that meaning is simultaneously personal and relational, immediate and cumulative, internal and external. The practice of adaptive creativity in the face of uncertainty extends into the formation of resilience. Resilience is not simply endurance or resistance. It is the capacity to maintain coherence, to generate effective responses, and to sustain purposeful engagement despite volatility and change. Solitude provides the foundation for this resilience by cultivating self-sufficiency, clarity of evaluation, and the capacity to inhabit and observe the internal system without being destabilized by external turbulence. Through these processes, the life of the solitary, coherent individual evolves into a dynamic, self-regulating system. Each encounter with uncertainty becomes an opportunity for refinement, each experience of impermanence a lesson in recalibration, each act of adaptive creativity a demonstration of the ongoing synthesis between stability and change. The individual's influence, insight, and structural contributions are compounded not merely by repetition, but by the continuous alignment of intention, perception, and action across variable contexts. In this way, uncertainty and impermanence cease to be external threats or sources of anxiety. They are integrated as essential components of the system itself. Solitude transforms them into instruments of refinement, clarifying judgment, sharpening perception, and deepening the capacity for meaningful engagement. The individual navigates complexity not as a passive observer or reactive participant, but as a deliberate agent capable of sustaining coherence, generating structure, and fostering adaptive influence across the mutable landscape of existence. Having cultivated temporal depth, ethical discernment, aesthetic sensibility, and adaptive creativity, the individual now turns attention to the relational dimension of existence. Solitude, while essential for internal coherence, is not a withdrawal from connection but a preparatory field, a space in which clarity, stability, and discernment are honed so that engagement with others can be deliberate, aligned, and meaningful. The first insight is that relationships, like systems, are complex and dynamic. They are composed of multiple agents, each with distinct internal structures, histories, and trajectories. Entering such spaces without internal coherence invites friction, distortion, or compromise of principles. Solitude provides the foundation for selective engagement, enabling the individual to approach relationships with awareness, intentionality, and an understanding of the boundaries of influence. Engagement is guided by a principle of resonance rather than control. The solitary individual does not seek to impose coherence upon others. Rather, the aim is alignment through compatibility of internal structures, clarity of intention, and consistency of action. Interaction becomes a form of calibration. The individual tests, observes, and responds, identifying spaces where values, priorities, and capacities can harmonize without loss of autonomy. Trust, respect, and authenticity emerge naturally within this framework. Relationships are cultivated through congruence between internal coherence and external expression, where consistency of judgment, integrity of action, and clarity of communication foster mutual recognition of structure and intention. Solitude strengthens these qualities by providing a stable reference point, a locus from which alignment can be evaluated without distortion from external pressures or social conformity. The dynamics of influence in relational contexts are nuanced. The solitary individual recognizes that change in others is rarely direct or immediate. It occurs through subtle demonstration, modeling, and consistency over time. Ethical and aesthetic sensibilities inform this process, guiding actions that are both principled and attuned to the relational field. Influence is exercised not as coercion, but as the projection of clarity and integrity into interactions, allowing others to respond freely within their own frameworks. Conflict and divergence are inevitable. No network of relationships is perfectly aligned, and tension between differing internal structures is natural. Solitude equips the individual to navigate such tension without destabilization, to maintain coherence while negotiating disagreement, and to discern when engagement is constructive, when compromise is appropriate, and when distance preserves both integrity and relational health. Over time, Relational integration produces layered networks of compatibility and trust. These networks do not require uniformity of belief or total agreement. They are structured around the mutual recognition of coherent internal systems and the capacity for reciprocal understanding. The solitary individual becomes both participant and stabilizing node, capable of sustaining connection while preserving independence, and able to contribute to collective clarity without sacrificing personal alignment. Relational dynamics are also informed by temporal awareness. Just as actions accumulate across time to shape legacy and systemic coherence, relationships develop through iterative interactions, repeated calibrations, and shared experiences. Solitude enables the individual to perceive these patterns, anticipate potential points of friction or growth, and act in ways that reinforce long-term stability, mutual understanding, and coherence within relational systems. This framework produces a subtle but profound refinement of interpersonal behavior. Communication is precise yet flexible, action is deliberate yet responsive, and judgment balances fidelity to principle with sensitivity to context. Engagement is measured by alignment and resonance rather than immediate outcomes or social metrics, allowing relationships to function as extensions of the internal system, rather than as external determinants of self-conception. The integration of solitude with relational practice transforms the individual's presence within collective environments. Influence is exercised indirectly through clarity, consistency, and intentionality, creating zones of stability within relational networks. Connections are cultivated with discernment, sustaining both autonomy and interdependence. Over time, this relational architecture amplifies the capacity for meaningful contribution, both within personal networks and broader systems, without sacrificing internal coherence or ethical clarity. Thus, relational integration is not an appendage to the solitary practice, but a natural evolution of it. Solitude informs interaction, providing a lens through which the complexities of human networks can be navigated, aligned, and sustained. The individual, having mastered coherence within self and across temporal scales, now extends that coherence outward, generating relational structures that are robust, adaptive, and resonant with the principles cultivated in the ongoing practice of being alone. With relational structures refined and networks of coherence established, the individual's focus naturally extends to the long-term propagation of insight, wisdom, and structured influence. Solitude, which has cultivated internal clarity, temporal continuity, and adaptive engagement, now serves as the foundation for generativity, the capacity to transmit principles, frameworks, and understanding in ways that endure beyond immediate presence. Generativity is not limited to direct instruction or prescriptive guidance. It emerges first as the modeling of coherence in action, the subtle demonstration of judgment, integrity, and alignment that others can observe, interpret, and integrate within their own structures. Each act of deliberate engagement, each decision executed with fidelity to internal principles, becomes a form of tacit mentorship, an indirect shaping of perception and understanding. Explicit mentorship extends this process. The solitary individual, having refined ethical and aesthetic sensibilities, temporal awareness, and relational acumen, is uniquely positioned to guide others without coercion or distortion. Instruction is calibrated for clarity and transferability. Insights are articulated in forms that respect the learner's internal structures while maintaining fidelity to the source principles. Teaching becomes a disciplined translation, the communication of complex frameworks in ways that can be understood, applied, and sustained across time. Propagation of insight also operates through structural intervention. Beyond individuals, the solitary practitioner may contribute to the formation or refinement of systems, institutions, or communities. These contributions are precise, targeted, and aligned with internal principles, designed to create environments in which coherence can be sustained and amplified. Rather than imposing uniformity, the aim is to cultivate conditions in which compatible internal structures can flourish, producing cumulative effects that ripple across temporal and relational networks. Time magnifies the significance of generativity. Ideas, habits, and frameworks established with integrity accumulate, interacting with other agents and systems to create zones of stability and coherence that persist long after immediate influence is exerted. The solitary individual develops awareness of these emergent patterns, observing how influence compounds not through visibility or popularity, but through structural alignment, resonance, and replication of coherent principles. Mentorship and generativity are inseparable from ethical discernment. Responsibility extends beyond immediate outcomes to encompass indirect and long-term effects. Solitude enables the individual to act with foresight, evaluating potential consequences, unintended consequences, and systemic interactions. Decisions are made with an understanding that the transmission of insight carries weight, shaping both the immediate environment and future trajectories. Adaptive creativity, previously applied to the navigation of uncertainty and impermanence, becomes critical in generative activity. The solitary individual learns to express and transmit insight in forms that are not rigid but adaptable to diverse contexts, ensuring that principles remain coherent even when applied in environments different from their origin. Each act of communication or system building is calibrated to maintain structural integrity while enabling contextual flexibility. Through these processes, the life structured by solitude extends its influence beyond the boundaries of immediate experience. Coherence, cultivated inwardly and tested across relational and temporal scales, radiates outward, shaping networks of understanding, guiding emergent systems, and contributing to the continuity of insight across generations. Solitude, once perceived as withdrawal, reveals itself as the precondition for responsible, deliberate, and durable generativity. Legacy, in this sense, is redefined. It is not measured solely in recognition, monuments, or immediate impact, but in the persistence of structures, principles, and frameworks that continue to guide, align, and stabilize the systems they enter. Influence is exercised through fidelity to internal coherence, the patient accumulation of insight, and the strategic propagation of understanding in ways that respect both the autonomy of others and the integrity of the principles being transmitted. Generativity thus becomes the outward expression of the internal architecture cultivated through solitude. The individual, having mastered alignment with self, temporality, relational systems, and ethical clarity, now engages in the deliberate creation of enduring patterns. This stage represents both a synthesis and an extension. The internal system, once confined to the self, now propagates across networks, time, and emergent structures, producing a cumulative effect that is subtle, persistent, and coherent. In this continuum, solitude is not abandonment, isolation, or withdrawal from life. It is the medium through which clarity, coherence, and integrity are cultivated, and through which influence, mentorship, and generativity are rendered precise, responsible, and enduring. The life of the solitary individual becomes both a system of self-consistency and a conduit for durable impact, demonstrating that the practice of being alone, when sustained and integrated, produces effects that resonate far beyond the boundaries of immediate perception. With generativity and mentorship established as modes of enduring influence, the solitary individual turns toward the reflective synthesis of experience. Solitude, which has guided the formation of internal coherence, temporal continuity, ethical and aesthetic discernment, adaptive creativity, and relational alignment, now provides the vantage from which the totality of a life can be observed as an evolving, interconnected system. Reflection at this stage is not passive rumination but active integration. The individual traces the arcs of decisions, actions, and consequences across years, discerning patterns that reveal both stability and change. Successes and failures, moments of alignment and friction, Achievements and losses are observed not in isolation, but as interconnected nodes within a coherent lattice of selfhood. Each episode of experience contributes to the architecture of the life system, informing the calibration of principles, the refinement of judgment, and the anticipation of future trajectories. Synthesis emerges from this reflective practice. Disparate experiences are woven together, producing a coherent narrative of agency, insight, and structural integrity. The individual begins to recognize recurrent themes, patterns of action, interaction, and consequence that reveal underlying principles guiding engagement with self, others, and the broader world. Solitude provides the temporal and perceptual space necessary to detect these patterns, revealing both the limits and the possibilities inherent within the evolving system of life. The perception of life as an evolving system deepens the understanding of influence and responsibility. Each act, each interaction, each structural contribution is evaluated within the context of cumulative effects across temporal, relational, and systemic dimensions. Awareness of propagation, feedback loops, and emergent patterns sharpens discernment, ensuring that decisions are coherent not only in the moment, but across the broader temporal and relational networks in which they operate. Reflection also illuminates the balance between autonomy and integration. The solitary individual recognizes that the life system is neither entirely self-contained nor wholly dictated by external forces. Coherence arises from the dynamic interplay between internal stability and external engagement, between deliberate action and responsive adaptation. Each adjustment, each recalibration, is informed by observation of systemic effects and the anticipation of emergent consequences, producing a continuously refined equilibrium between independence and interdependence. Within this framework, the individual cultivates an iterative approach to living. Principles are tested against reality, insights are applied, outcomes are observed, and refinements are made. The life system functions as a self-regulating mechanism, capable of sustaining alignment, adapting to variability, and maintaining integrity even amid complexity and change. Solitude provides the scaffolding for this iterative practice, enabling the individual to step back, observe, and adjust without the distortions of reactive or externally imposed pressures. Temporal continuity and systemic reflection also shape the perception of legacy. Influence is recognized as cumulative, often indirect and frequently delayed. The life system itself becomes the vessel of enduring impact. The structures, patterns, and frameworks cultivated through coherent practice extend across relational networks, temporal layers, and emergent environments. Legacy is measured less by immediate recognition than by the persistence of alignment, clarity, and coherence within the systems the individual has engaged. Finally, reflection and synthesis cultivate a form of meta-awareness, the capacity to observe one's own internal system as both participant and architect. The individual discerns the interactions between principles, practices, decisions, and consequences, recognizing the ways in which coherence has been maintained, challenged, or refined. This meta-perspective allows for ongoing adjustment, the anticipation of future perturbations, and the conscious shaping of the life system as an integrated, evolving whole. Through sustained reflection and synthesis, the solitary individual perceives existence not as a series of disconnected events, but as a continuous, structured, and evolving system. Each moment, relationship, and contribution is situated within an integrated framework of internal coherence, temporal continuity, ethical and aesthetic clarity, relational resonance, and generative influence. Solitude, far from being withdrawal, is revealed as the medium through which the architecture of life is constructed, observed, refined, and perpetuated. The life system thus becomes both the product and the instrument of coherent existence, a dynamic, adaptive, and reflective structure, capable of sustaining clarity, amplifying insight, and extending influence across time, networks, and contexts. Solitude enables the individual to inhabit this system fully, maintaining alignment while engaging with complexity, integrating past experience with present action, and projecting coherence into the unfolding horizon of life. As the individual's life system matures, attention naturally extends toward vision, not as abstract aspiration, but as the deliberate projection of coherence into increasingly complex environments. Solitude, having established internal clarity, temporal integration, relational alignment, and generative capacity, now provides the vantage from which emergent complexity can be perceived, anticipated, and navigated. The individual learns to approach life not merely as a sequence of discrete events, but as an intricate, self-organizing system in which subtle actions, alignments, and interventions produce cascading effects. Vision, in this context, is inseparable from coherence. It arises not from fanciful idealism, but from sustained observation of patterns within oneself, others, and the networks in which one participates. By tracing the interactions of principles, behaviors, and consequences over time, the individual discerns trajectories that are both feasible and aligned with internal integrity. The solitary vantage allows for the detection of structural opportunities, points at which intervention, modeling, or guidance can generate disproportionate effects without compromising coherence. Emergent complexity is simultaneously an opportunity and a challenge. Systems composed of multiple autonomous agents, fluctuating conditions, and competing values resist simplification. Attempts to impose uniformity often produce instability or distortion. The solitary individual, grounded in internal coherence, learns to navigate this complexity through selective alignment, adaptive creativity, and recursive feedback. Influence is exercised with subtlety, precision, and patience, targeting areas where clarity can propagate organically, and systems can self-stabilize around coherent principles. This approach transforms action into a disciplined form of strategic engagement. Each decision is evaluated not only for immediate impact, but for its potential to resonate within wider networks, cascade through relational structures, and interact with emergent patterns. Solitude provides the temporal and perceptual distance necessary to anticipate indirect consequences, to model alternative scenarios internally, and to act with foresight rather than reactivity. The individual cultivates the capacity to shape outcomes indirectly, producing alignment through resonance rather than coercion. Generativity extends naturally into vision. Mentorship, structural contribution, and the propagation of insight are now oriented toward the long-term stabilization of coherent principles within evolving systems. Legacy is understood not as static inheritance, but as dynamic influence. Frameworks, patterns, and relationships are structured to endure and adapt, providing scaffolding for others while remaining flexible to contextual variability. Solitude ensures that such transmission retains fidelity to internal coherence, even as it engages with diverse and unpredictable environments. The cultivation of enduring influence requires an intimate understanding of both agency and limitation. The individual recognizes that not all systems are malleable, that not all relationships respond predictably, and that some emergent dynamics lie beyond direct control. Acceptance of these limits does not induce passivity. Rather, it sharpens discernment, directing attention and energy toward interventions that are meaningful, coherent, and sustainable. Frustration is minimized because action is measured against internal criteria rather than contingent outcomes. Vision and emergent complexity also refine the understanding of time and scale. The individual perceives that impact operates across multiple layers simultaneously. Immediate effects within personal networks, medium-term influence across institutional or cultural structures, and long-term resonance across temporal and relational horizons. Solitude provides the vantage from which these scales can be observed, integrated, and aligned, enabling coherent projection of action without sacrificing integrity. Adaptive creativity, previously applied to uncertainty and relational engagement, now functions as a tool for systemic shaping. The individual generates responses and interventions that maintain coherence while accommodating complexity, uncertainty, and emergent variability. Each act is both principled and situationally aware, a balance of fidelity to internal structure and responsiveness to external dynamics. Through sustained practice, the individual develops a meta-pattern, the capacity to perceive life as a continuously evolving system of interacting forces in which internal coherence, relational alignment, temporal continuity, and adaptive insight interact to produce meaningful, durable influence. Solitude serves as both the anchor and the lens. It enables observation of complexity without distortion, decision-making with integrity, and engagement with emergent systems in ways that are deliberate, coherent, and generative. The cultivation of vision within emergent complexity transforms the role of the solitary individual from participant to architect, not of rigid systems, but of conditions in which coherence can propagate, structures can stabilize, and principles can endure. The individual becomes a node of clarity within broader networks, a generator of adaptive patterns, and a steward of influence that persists across time, scale, and relational multiplicity. As vision and generativity deepen, the solitary individual moves toward reflective mastery, the capacity to observe, evaluate, and guide the evolving life system with both precision and equanimity. Solitude, having cultivated clarity, temporal continuity, ethical and aesthetic sensibility, relational alignment, and adaptive engagement, now enables the orchestration of existence as a coherent, self-regulating system. Reflection becomes not a passive act but an active process of meta-observation, in which the interplay of principles, actions, relationships, and consequences is continuously examined, interpreted, and refined. This reflective mastery strengthens resilience. Life's inherent unpredictability, its uncertainties, conflicts, and impermanence, is approached not as a source of disruption, but as an essential dimension of the system itself. Solitude allows the individual to maintain stability amid flux, to act decisively under conditions of ambiguity, and to sustain alignment even when external validation, recognition, or immediate outcomes are absent or delayed. Resilience emerges as an integration of internal coherence, adaptive insight, and long-term perspective, producing a capacity to endure, respond, and flourish across a multiplicity of contexts. The orchestration of life at this stage involves continuous calibration. Decisions, interactions, and contributions are assessed not solely for their immediate utility, but for their alignment with the overarching lattice of principles, coherence, and temporal patterns established over decades. Reflection allows the individual to discern which habits, practices, or relational strategies require reinforcement, which require adaptation, and which may be abandoned to maintain systemic integrity. The life system functions as a dynamic equilibrium, responsive to change yet anchored in principle. Emergent patterns are observed and leveraged. Through reflection, the individual detects recurring motifs within behavior, relationships, and environmental response. These patterns inform strategy. Moments of tension reveal structural vulnerabilities, while instances of alignment illuminate areas of amplified influence. Solitude permits the individual to interpret these patterns with clarity, integrating insights into ongoing decision-making and guiding both immediate action and long-term planning. Resilience is further amplified by anticipatory reflection. The solitary individual projects potential futures across multiple dimensions: personal development, relational networks, systemic influence, and temporal consequences, evaluating the alignment of present action with desired trajectories. Solitude enables this foresight by providing the cognitive and emotional space to simulate outcomes, weigh probabilities, and anticipate indirect consequences, without the distortion of reactive impulses or external pressures. The orchestration of life integrates previously cultivated capacities. Ethical discernment guides decisions. Aesthetic sensibility shapes the perception of harmony, proportion, and resonance. Relational clarity ensures engagement is deliberate and coherent. Generativity ensures principles and insights are transmitted effectively. And temporal continuity allows actions and patterns to compound meaningfully across time. Each of these elements is continuously observed, adjusted, and harmonized through reflective practice, producing a life system that is adaptive, integrated, and aligned. Through this process, the individual cultivates what may be called structural intentionality, the capacity to guide complex systems of self, relationship, and influence with precision and integrity. Life is approached as a continuously evolving composition, in which each act, each decision, each interaction contributes to the coherence, stability, and resonance of the whole. Solitude provides both the perspective and the scaffolding for this orchestration, enabling clarity in observation, fidelity in action, and alignment across scales of time, space, and relational complexity. The resulting system is robust yet flexible, coherent yet responsive, principled yet adaptive. The individual navigates emergent complexity without being overwhelmed, influences networks without domination, and sustains integrity without rigidity. Reflection and solitude together allow for the continuous refinement of self, relationships, and contribution, producing an existence in which coherence is both lived and projected. Internal clarity translates into external alignment, and the life system itself becomes a self-perpetuating architecture of purpose, insight, and resilience. At this stage, mastery is not measured by external accolades or material accumulation. It is measured by the capacity to maintain coherence under pressure, to navigate complexity with clarity, to integrate experience into actionable insight, and to sustain influence across time and networks. Solitude has transformed from a condition of separation into the mechanism through which life itself is observed, refined, and orchestrated, producing a continuum of alignment that extends from the self into the wider systems of which the individual is a part. With reflective mastery and resilience established, the solitary individual enters a phase in which internal coherence intersects with emergent influence on broader systems. Solitude, having refined temporal continuity, ethical and aesthetic sensibilities, relational integration, generativity, and systemic orchestration, now enables the cultivation of innovation, the application of wisdom, and the emergence of leadership that is neither coercive nor superficial, but coherent, principled, and adaptive. Innovation arises naturally from sustained engagement with complexity. The individual, familiar with the dynamics of self, relationships, and networks, is able to perceive gaps, tensions, and opportunities that are invisible to those operating without coherent internal reference points. Novel solutions, refined strategies, and creative interventions emerge not as impulsive or reactive acts, but as deliberate responses grounded in accumulated insight and structural clarity. Solitude ensures that such innovation is guided by internal criteria rather than external expectation, producing outcomes that are meaningful, coherent, and aligned with enduring principles. Wisdom in this context is inseparable from lived experience and reflective practice. It is the integration of insight accumulated over time, synthesized from observation, action, and consequence across multiple domains. Wisdom allows the individual to navigate uncertainty with discernment, to evaluate trade-offs with clarity, and to anticipate emergent patterns within both social and systemic contexts. Unlike knowledge, which can be acquired externally, wisdom is inseparable from the structured, iterative engagement with self and environment cultivated through solitude. Emergent leadership is the outward expression of this integration. Leadership at this stage is not defined by position, authority, or control. It is defined by the capacity to influence, guide, and stabilize systems through clarity, example, and subtle intervention. The solitary individual exerts influence indirectly, shaping perceptions, modeling alignment, and cultivating conditions in which others, coherence and effectiveness are enhanced. Leadership becomes an emergent property of sustained internal and relational coherence, amplified by insight, ethical clarity, and adaptive creativity. Engagement with emergent complexity requires careful calibration. Systems composed of autonomous agents, shifting conditions, and competing values resist uniform solutions. The individual applies judgment to determine where intervention will amplify coherence, where alignment can be encouraged without coercion, and where restraint preserves both autonomy and systemic integrity. Solitude provides the observational capacity to detect these opportunities and the emotional and cognitive stability to act without compromising principle. Time magnifies the impact of innovation and emergent leadership. Actions taken today propagate through relational and systemic networks, influencing trajectories that may only become visible years later. Solitude provides the temporal perspective necessary to evaluate these effects, to anticipate unintended consequences, and to maintain alignment even when immediate feedback is delayed, ambiguous, or absent. The individual acts in accordance with enduring criteria, valuing structural integrity over transient recognition. Ethical discernment remains central. Influence, no matter how subtle or principled, carries consequences that extend across individuals, networks, and systems. Decisions are evaluated not only for efficacy, but for alignment with coherent principles, sustainability across time, and resonance with the patterns of relational and systemic interaction. Wisdom guides these evaluations, ensuring that innovation and leadership are exercised responsibly, with awareness of indirect and cumulative effects. Relational integration amplifies emergent leadership. The networks cultivated through deliberate engagement, mutual recognition, and structural alignment serve as conduits for influence, allowing principles and insight to propagate without distortion or coercion. The individual maintains both autonomy and relational resonance, navigating tensions, divergences, and misalignments with discernment and patience, fostering stability and coherence across complex systems. Through this synthesis, the life system of the solitary individual achieves a form of dynamic coherence at scale. Innovation, wisdom, and leadership emerge not as episodic acts but as continuous expressions of structural integrity, temporal awareness, relational acumen, and ethical discernment. Solitude is revealed not as separation, but as the enabling condition for principled influence, sustainable guidance, and the responsible propagation of insight across networks and generations. In this stage, the individual functions simultaneously as observer, participant, and architect, capable of navigating complexity, generating meaningful novelty, and cultivating enduring alignment within systems that are themselves fluid, adaptive, and interconnected. Influence is measured not by immediate impact but by resonance, persistence, and structural amplification, ensuring that actions maintain coherence across the temporal, relational, and systemic dimensions in which they occur. As the individual progresses through sustained solitude, reflective mastery, adaptive creativity, relational refinement, and emergent leadership, attention turns to the integration of lifelong practice and the cultivation of emergent insight across extended temporal and relational horizons. Solitude, once a condition of withdrawal, now functions as the organizing principle through which coherence, purpose, and influence are continuously maintained, amplified, and projected into both immediate and far-reaching systems. Lifelong practice is characterized by iterative engagement, the disciplined alignment of attention, reflection, and action across decades of experience. Each moment is evaluated in relation to internal principles, long-term trajectories, and relational consequences, producing a cumulative architecture of coherence. Solitude allows the individual to observe this evolving structure from both within and without, identifying areas requiring reinforcement, adjustment, or transformation. Practice is neither ritualistic nor rigid. It is adaptive, responsive, and integrative, continuously calibrated to maintain internal integrity while engaging with dynamic external environments. Emergent insight arises from the synthesis of reflection, observation, and interaction. Patterns that were once subtle or obscured become perceptible through sustained attention and the accumulation of experience. Insight extends beyond the individual. It informs relational networks, guides systemic interventions, and shapes the propagation of principles and structures across multiple scales. Solitude provides the cognitive and emotional space necessary to discern these patterns, enabling the individual to act with foresight, precision, and coherence. The integration of extended coherence requires recognition of interdependence. While internal alignment remains foundational, the individual perceives that influence is mediated through networks of interaction, systemic dynamics, and temporal propagation. Each action, decision, and contribution is situated within a broader lattice of effects, ripple patterns, and emergent responses. Solitude equips the individual to navigate these interdependencies without compromise of principle, maintaining clarity while accommodating complexity. Resilience, previously cultivated through reflection and adaptive creativity, is now exercised at a higher scale. Lifelong coherence demands the capacity to sustain alignment through periods of turbulence, systemic instability, and relational flux. The individual maintains structural integrity while responding to emergent demands, using insight, patience, and strategic action to preserve both internal and external equilibrium. Solitude ensures that resilience is rooted in clarity rather than reaction, producing stability that is self-sustaining and generative. Emergent influence at this stage is both subtle and expansive. The individual acts through modeling, mentorship, and structural contribution, shaping patterns of behavior, expectation, and alignment across relational and systemic networks. Actions are calibrated not for immediate recognition, but for durability, resonance, and fidelity to coherent principles. Solitude allows the individual to evaluate influence in terms of structural effect rather than social visibility, emphasizing the propagation of clarity, alignment, and ethical integrity across networks and time. Reflection now operates as a continuous meta-practice. The individual observes the interaction between principle, action, and consequence, integrating new experience into the evolving system without disruption. This recursive observation refines judgment, enhances foresight, and supports the ongoing alignment of internal structures with external realities. Each cycle of reflection contributes to the deepening of insight, the refinement of practice, and the amplification of influence across temporal and relational dimensions. Through lifelong practice, emergent insight, and extended coherence, the solitary individual achieves a distinctive form of systemic maturity. Existence is approached as an interconnected, self-regulating system in which internal alignment, temporal continuity, relational resonance, ethical discernment, aesthetic sensibility, adaptive creativity, generativity, and emergent leadership interact continuously. Each element reinforces and calibrates the others, producing a dynamic equilibrium capable of sustaining clarity, fostering growth, and amplifying influence across time, scale, and complexity. In this stage, solitude is fully integrated into life not as absence, but as the medium through which the architecture of being, action, and influence is continuously observed, refined, and propagated. The individual functions as both the nucleus and the lens of a coherent life system, capable of guiding action with precision, sustaining alignment across uncertainty, and generating effects that ripple through relational networks, social systems, and temporal trajectories. The lifelong practice of being alone thus evolves into a disciplined, self-sustaining and generative engagement with existence itself.